Hayden Panettiere, neighbor, hears crying and screaming before the star's death.
What if the most important new information in the Hayden Panettiere investigation is not something investigators found in South Carolina? What if it is something a neighbor says she saw and heard years earlier? Because, as the investigation into Hayden's death continues, a woman who lived only doors away from her in West Hollywood is describing a pattern that she says left her genuinely afraid. She says she heard Hayden crying and screaming, and she says there were loud confrontations when Brian Hickerson was around. She also describes seeing Hayden removed from the apartment on a gurney on more than one occasion. None of that establishes how Hayden died. It does not prove that Brian Hickerson caused her death. And it does not turn a neighbor's recollection into a medical or investigative finding. But it does something important. It gives us another window into the period of Hayden's life that came before the final day, and that matters now because the relationship at the center of those old warnings has become part of the scrutiny surrounding her death. Hayden Panettiere was found unresponsive at a residence in Greenville, South Carolina, on August 16, 2026. Emergency crews were called. Attempts were made to revive her, and she was pronounced dead that afternoon at just 36 years old. The preliminary information released publicly has not established homicide. Reports say there were no obvious traumatic injuries identified that explained her death, and the official cause and manner remained under investigation while additional medical and toxicology work was being completed. At the same time, Brian Hickerson was there. His brother Zach was there. Medication was reportedly turned over to police and Narcan. The medication commonly used to reverse an opioid overdose was reportedly present as well. That alone has generated enormous speculation, especially because Hayden had a long history with addiction, and because the man beside her in those final hours was the same man whose relationship with her had already ended in a criminal case involving violence. So the questions are obvious. What happened during Hayden's final morning? What happened after Brian left the residence and returned? When was Hayden last known to be conscious? Who found her? When was Narcan administered? And what will the medical evidence eventually tell investigators about what actually caused her death? Those questions are still open, and that is why the neighbor's story matters. Before we get into it, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me where you are watching from. It is a small thing, but it helps this reporting reach the people who are following the case and want the next verified development rather than another round of speculation. Because the story coming out of West Hollywood is disturbing enough on its own, and it becomes even more difficult to ignore when you place it beside what we now know about Hayden's relationship with Brian Hickerson. The neighbor who has now come forward is Mia Terrazas. She lived close enough to Hayden that the walls and common areas of the building brought her into contact with sounds and events that most people outside that residence would never have known about. And according to her recent accounts, there were times when the relationship next door did not sound like a normal disagreement between two people who happened to live together. She says there were arguments, screaming, and moments when she was concerned enough to contact law enforcement. In one account, she described hearing Hayden pleading with Brian to stop. That is one of those details that stays with you because it is so specific. It is not a neighbor saying years later that she got the impression the couple fought. She is describing words she says she heard. But even here, there is a line we have to hold. A neighbor can tell us what she heard. She can tell us what she saw. She can tell us whether she felt afraid. What she cannot do is establish, from her apartment or from a hallway, exactly what happened inside another person's room during every argument. She cannot tell us the cause of an injury simply because she thought someone looked hurt. And she certainly cannot tell us, from those earlier incidents alone, what happened in a completely different residence in South Carolina years later. That is not a criticism of her account. It is the distinction that responsible reporting requires. What we can say is that her testimony adds to an existing record. Hayden herself had already spoken publicly about the relationship with Hickerson and about the abuse she experienced. Hickerson had previously been prosecuted in connection with violence against her. He pleaded no contest in 2021 and faced criminal consequences as a result. Hayden later wrote about the relationship and the damage it had caused her. So when Terrazas now describes hearing Hayden pleading with Brian to stop, she is not introducing the concept of abuse into a story where it did not exist before. She is describing her own experience of a relationship that already had a documented history of violence. And then there are the occasions when she says the situation became serious enough for emergency responders to appear. According to recent reporting, Terraza says Hayden was taken from the building on a gurney on 2 occasions, including incidents in 2023 and 2024. She has described Hayden as appearing injured, including what she believed were bruises or red marks. Her daughter reportedly saw at least some of what happened as well. Again, those observations need to stay in their proper category. A neighbor's description of what a person looked like is not the same thing as a medical record. It is witness testimony. It can be useful. It can be corroborated or challenged. It can help investigators reconstruct a pattern, but it should not be promoted into a medical conclusion simply because it fits a narrative we already know. What makes it significant is the combination of events. The same neighbor who says she heard repeated confrontations also says she saw Hayden removed from the building on multiple occasions. The same relationship at the center of those incidents had already resulted in criminal proceedings. And now, after Hayden's death, another piece of information has surfaced suggesting that concerns surrounding Brian's presence may not have been limited to one neighbor. The Homeowners Association at the West Hollywood property reportedly posted warnings concerning Brian Hickerson. Residents were reportedly shown his photograph and advised to contact police if they saw him on the property. That does not mean the Homeowners Association knew what would eventually happen to Hayden. It does not mean every resident had the same concern. And it does not establish that the association's warnings had anything to do with Hayden's eventual death. What it does suggest is that the concerns surrounding Hickerson had become visible to other people in the building. The relationship was no longer simply a private matter that existed between 2 people behind a closed door. According to the reporting, there were enough concerns about his presence for the community itself to become involved. And that is important context, because when we eventually get to August 16th, we are not starting from zero. We are starting with a documented history. Hayden and Brian's relationship had already been through a public cycle of reconciliation, separation, allegations, court proceedings, and attempts to move forward. There had been violence, there had been criminal consequences, and there had been moments when Hayden still expressed affection for him, despite everything that had happened. That complexity is uncomfortable, but it is real. People outside an abusive relationship often imagine that once a person recognizes the abuse, leaving is straightforward. In reality, relationships involving addiction, trauma, emotional dependence, financial instability, fear, and repeated promises of change can be incredibly difficult to break apart. Hayden was also dealing with her own struggles. And those struggles did not simply disappear because the public knew about them. She had spent years dealing with addiction. She had entered treatment. She had spoken openly about trying to rebuild her life. She had talked about her daughter and about wanting a different future. And in the middle of that, Brian kept reappearing in the story. That history is now being revisited because the final chapter is so different from the one Hayden and the people around her had hoped for. On August 16th, the emergency call came from Greenville, South Carolina. The first publicly reported details described a cardiac arrest. Hayden was found unresponsive. Responders attempted life-saving measures. She was eventually pronounced dead. The police response became significant for another reason. Brian Hickerson and his brother Zach were there. According to reporting based on the police report, the brothers were involved in the response, and a bag containing medication Hayden had been taking was turned over to investigators. That does not tell us what killed her. It does, however, tell us what investigators had in front of them from the very beginning: an unexplained death, a history of substance use, a man with a documented history of violence toward the woman who had died, medication at the scene, Narcan reportedly present, and a timeline that the public still does not fully understand. One of the biggest problems with stories like this is that people start treating uncertainty as though it is evidence of guilt. That is not how an investigation works. An unexplained death is not automatically a homicide. A person with a troubling history is not automatically responsible for a new event. And an inconsistency in a public statement is not automatically proof that someone is lying. Sometimes people remember differently. Sometimes people describe medical emergencies poorly, sometimes people use the wrong words, and sometimes there really is something being concealed. The job is to determine which one it is. That is why the final hours matter so much. According to reporting based in part on information provided by Hayden's mother, Brian reportedly told police that earlier that morning Hayden had been doing her makeup and that everything appeared normal. At some point, he left the residence to get something. What exactly he went to get has not been publicly established. That creates a gap in the timeline. And the gap matters. When he returned, what condition was Hayden in? Was she still awake? Did they speak? Did something happen while he was gone? Did nothing happen at all? Publicly, we do not have those answers. The account later described by Zach is that the brothers eventually found Hayden unresponsive and attempted to revive her, with Brian administering Narcan. Again, that is a reported account. It is not an independent finding that explains Hayden's death. But if that account is accurate, then the exact timing of the Narcan administration becomes important. Was Hayden still alive when it was given? What substances, if any, were present in her system? Had an opioid caused the emergency? Had something else caused it? Did multiple substances play a role? And what do the medical findings say about the condition Hayden was in when the men say they found her? Those answers are far more important than any television theory. Narcan can reverse the effects of opioids when administered in an appropriate situation, but the fact that Narcan was present does not prove that an opioid caused Hayden's death. It also does not establish who used it or exactly when it was administered. That is one of those places where this story needs to stay grounded, because there is a temptation to take a medical detail and use it to tell the audience what happened. We are not going to do that. The evidence has to do that. What we can do is examine why the evidence matters. If toxicology shows an opioid, that becomes important. If it shows multiple substances, that becomes important. If it shows something unexpected, that becomes important. If the medical examiner ultimately concludes that the death was caused by something entirely different, then the meaning of everything else changes with it. The medical evidence is not a footnote to the story. It is the story. And that is why the preliminary autopsy finding deserves attention. Reports indicate that there was no obvious trauma identified that explained Hayden's death. That is significant because it means investigators did not have a simple physical explanation in front of them. They were left to determine what caused the cardiac arrest and whether substances, medical conditions, or some combination of factors played a role. It also means that the public conversation around Brian's previous violence has to be handled carefully. A history of abuse matters. It cannot simply be ignored because the preliminary autopsy did not show a fatal injury. But it also cannot be converted into a conclusion that he caused this death when investigators have not made that finding. And that brings us back to the timeline. Hayden's mother has publicly questioned parts of the account that have emerged about the final morning. Her concern appears to focus on the gaps between the different descriptions of what Brian was doing, when he left, when he came back, and when Hayden was found unresponsive. That does not prove that his account is false. It does mean the timeline is important enough that people close to Hayden are asking for a clearer explanation. And that is something investigators can actually test. People can remember incorrectly, but surveillance cameras do not have memories. Phone records do not have memories. Location data does not have memories. Digital messages do not have memories. That is why objective evidence tends to matter more than public interviews as an investigation progresses. If cameras captured Brian leaving the residence, investigators can establish when he left. If they captured him returning, investigators can establish when he returned. If a phone was active during that period, investigators may be able to establish communications. If a purchase occurred, there may be a record. If emergency services received a call at a specific time, that call can anchor the final part of the timeline. And if toxicology can tell investigators what was in Hayden's body, that evidence can be compared against everything else. That is how investigators turn a confusing story into a sequence of events. The public, of course, wants the answer immediately, but investigators do not get to skip the process simply because the audience is impatient. That is especially true when a life is at stake, because a false conclusion does not become less damaging simply because it was reached quickly. There has also been attention on the reported involvement of the Drug Enforcement Administration. That development has fueled speculation that the investigation must already be moving toward a homicide theory, but that is not what the public evidence establishes. Federal drug investigators can become involved in cases for a number of reasons, particularly when controlled substances, sources, distribution, or broader drug activity may be relevant. The fact that federal resources are being used tells us the substance-related aspect of the case is being taken seriously. It does not tell us the final answer, and that distinction is worth repeating because this story has already produced more speculation than evidence. Another area receiving attention is the question of Hayden's belongings and money. Reporting has included allegations from her mother that Brian pawned some of Hayden's possessions, including a vintage guitar, in the period before her death. That is a serious allegation, but here again, we have to separate the allegation from the conclusion. There is a difference between reporting that Hayden's mother says Brian pawned items belonging to her and claiming that he was systematically exploiting Hayden financially as part of a plan connected to her death. The first is a reportable allegation. The second would require evidence. It is tempting to draw a larger theory around addiction, money, control, and abuse because those themes are already present in Hayden's story. But the fact that a theory fits does not make it true. The most compelling version of this story is the one that does not need us to invent the missing pieces. The documented history is disturbing enough. Hayden had previously accused Brian of abuse. He had been convicted in connection with violence against her. Neighbors now say they heard screaming and witnessed disturbing incidents. A homeowners association reportedly warned residents about him. And then years later, Hayden died while he was present at the residence. That is already enough to explain why investigators and the public are asking questions. We do not need to go further than the evidence allows. In fact, the closer we stay to the evidence, the more interesting the unanswered questions become, because there is a very real distinction between what we know about Hayden's life and what we know about her death. We know a great deal about the former. The latter remains incomplete. We know that Hayden had battled addiction for years. We know she entered treatment. We know she wanted to rebuild her life. We know she had a daughter she loved deeply. We know she had spoken publicly about the abuse she experienced. We know that Brian Hickerson had already faced criminal consequences for violence against her. We know neighbors say they heard things that frightened them. And we know she died suddenly in South Carolina. What we do not know is exactly how those final hours unfolded. That is the line between history and investigation. And it is where the story needs to remain. There is one additional fact that is difficult to ignore because of the timing. Only days before Hayden's death, Brian's attempt to have his previous convictions expunged was reportedly denied. The judge rejected the request. That happened on August 13th. Hayden died 3 days later. The timing is striking. But timing is not causation. There is no public evidence establishing that Hayden and Brian argued about the ruling. There is no public evidence establishing that the decision changed his behavior, and there is no evidence publicly connecting the court's decision to Hayden's death. So it belongs in the chronology, but not in the conclusion. That difference may sound small, but it is actually one of the most important rules in this entire story. You can place facts next to each other without claiming they caused one another. And in a case like this, that discipline matters. Because once the public decides on a theory, every new detail starts getting interpreted through that theory. A witness says one thing, and it becomes proof. A medical detail appears, and it becomes proof. A person was present, and that becomes proof. An old argument is remembered, and suddenly the argument is treated as though investigators know exactly what it meant. That is how speculation becomes accepted as fact. And it is precisely what we should avoid. The neighbor's testimony is another example. Her account is important because she says she heard Hayden pleading for Brian to stop. But that does not tell us what happened on August 16th. What it tells us is that the relationship had a disturbing history that was witnessed by someone outside the couple. That is useful. It gives investigators and the public another piece of context. It may help corroborate parts of Hayden's own descriptions of the relationship. It may explain why people in the building were concerned. And it may show that the difficulties between Hayden and Brian were not invisible to everyone around them. But the neighbor cannot answer the central question. Only the evidence from the final day can do that. And this is where I think the current reporting becomes much more interesting than the louder speculation. Because the real issue is not simply, did Hayden and Brian have a troubled relationship? We already know they did. The real issue is, what happened after the relationship's history met the final hours of Hayden's life? That is where the investigation lives. What happened when Brian left? What happened after he came back? What was Hayden doing immediately before she became unresponsive? What substances were in her system? Who was awake? Who discovered her? When did they realize what was happening? When was Narcan administered? And what does the official medical evidence eventually conclude? Those are questions that can be answered. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they are answerable through evidence, and evidence is ultimately what separates a compelling theory from a proven fact. There is another reason this story deserves a careful tone. Hayden Panettiere was a child star. That means millions of people felt like they knew her long before they actually did. They watched her grow up. They watched her career change. They watched her become a mother. They watched her discuss addiction. They watched her disappear from the public eye and return. And when someone who has been in the public eye for most of their life dies, there is a strange tendency to treat the entire life as though it belongs to the audience. It does not. Hayden was still a daughter, still a mother, still a friend, still a person trying to recover from things that most viewers only saw from a distance. That is why the neighbor's story should be treated as more than a sensational soundbite. A neighbor hearing screaming is not glamorous. There is nothing entertaining about it. It is the kind of thing that happens in ordinary buildings, in ordinary rooms, while the outside world continues moving. The only reason we are talking about this particular apartment now is because the woman inside it later became the subject of a death investigation. That is what changes the meaning of the memory. A sound that once seemed like another disturbing night becomes, after the fact, part of a much larger story. And that is why people come forward. Because they replay the moments in their minds and wonder whether they should have understood them differently. The neighbor may never know what happened to Hayden, but she knows what she says she heard, and she knows what she says she saw. Those memories cannot answer the case on their own. They can, however, help investigators understand the circumstances surrounding Hayden's life. The same is true of the Homeowners Association warnings. They do not solve the death. They show that concerns about Hickerson existed among people around Hayden. The same is true of the previous conviction. It does not solve the death. It establishes a documented history between Hayden and Brian. The same is true of the medication. It does not automatically establish an overdose. It creates a medical question that toxicology must answer. The same is true of the Narcan. Its presence does not explain the death. Its timing and the medical evidence surrounding it may help investigators understand what happened. And the same is true of the missing portions of the timeline. A gap is not a confession. It is simply a gap. The investigation has to fill it. That is why the coming medical findings matter so much. If the official cause of death points clearly to an accidental overdose, the story takes one direction. If investigators discover a different medical explanation, it takes another. If toxicology reveals a combination of substances, that becomes a central part of understanding the death. And if additional evidence emerges showing something investigators have not publicly discussed, then the story changes again. The public is not owed a theory. The public is owed the truth when investigators have established it. That may sound like a small distinction, but it is actually everything in a case like this, because Hayden's death is already tragic. The last thing anyone needs is for the truth to become harder to find, because the story was covered faster than it could be understood. That is why the strongest questions right now are not the most sensational ones. They are the simplest. What did the medical examination show? What did toxicology show? What was Hayden doing before she became unresponsive? What did the people around her say happened? Can those accounts be corroborated? And what do the objective records say? Those are the questions that should remain at the center. The answer may eventually be straightforward. It may not. But either way, the evidence will determine it. And that brings us back to the title of this story. New details have emerged. A neighbor says she heard crying and screaming. She says she saw Hayden in distress. She says there were occasions when emergency responders took Hayden away from the apartment, and those memories are now being examined in the shadow of Hayden's death. But the most important thing to understand is that the neighbor's story is about the years leading up to the death, not proof of what happened on the day Hayden died. That does not make it less important. In some ways, it makes it more important, because it gives us context instead of pretending to give us a conclusion. It shows us that Hayden's relationship with Brian had been troubling long before the final emergency call. It shows us that people around them were reportedly concerned. And it gives us another reason to ask whether the final hours deserve a closer look than the public has been able to give them so far. Hayden's family is still waiting for answers. The public is still waiting for official findings, and investigators are still working through evidence that most people have never seen. There is no responsible reason to pretend that we know more than they do. What we can do is keep the record straight. We can acknowledge the neighbor's testimony without turning it into a verdict. We can discuss Brian's documented past without using it as proof of a new crime. We can examine the Narcan and medication evidence without pretending toxicology has already told us the answer. And we can look at the timeline closely without filling the gaps with our imagination. That is what this case needs. Not louder speculation, better questions. Because the unanswered questions are already serious enough. What happened during Hayden's final morning? Why was Brian away from the residence, according to the account that has been reported? What happened after he returned? When did Hayden become unresponsive? Who discovered her? What exactly was administered? What will the toxicology show? And what will the official cause and manner of death ultimately be? Until those questions are answered, the most responsible thing we can say is also the most honest. We do not know yet. And we do not know yet is not the end of an investigation. It is the reason the investigation continues. There is also a more personal reason to remember that. Hayden Panettiere spent years trying to find a way out of the cycle that had consumed parts of her life. She talked about recovery. She talked about her daughter. She tried to rebuild. Whatever happens next in this investigation, none of that should be reduced to a single headline about how she died. The neighbors' memories matter because they remind us that there was a woman living behind those walls and that some people around her were concerned about what they were hearing. The legal history matters because it establishes that those concerns were not appearing from nowhere. The final timeline matters because Hayden's death remains unresolved, and the medical evidence matters because it is the only thing capable of telling us, with authority, what happened inside her body when those final moments unfolded. Everything else is context. Some of that context is troubling, some of it is painful, some of it is deeply difficult to hear, but none of it should be mistaken for a conclusion that investigators have not reached. So for now, this is where the Hayden Panettiere story stands. A 36-year-old actress and mother is dead. A neighbor has come forward with memories of crying, screaming, arguments, and frightening incidents from years earlier. Brian Hickerson, who had a documented history of violence against Hayden, was present during the emergency surrounding her death. Narcan and medication were reportedly present. The preliminary examination did not identify trauma that explains the death. The exact timeline of Hayden's final hours remains under scrutiny, and the final medical answers have not yet been made public. That is the record. Everything beyond that still needs to be proven. And perhaps that is the hardest part of this story, because people naturally want the ending immediately. They want one sentence that explains everything. They want to know who is responsible. They want to know what happened behind that door, but real investigations rarely arrive that cleanly. They come together slowly. A witness statement here, a phone record there, a medical finding, a surveillance image, a document nobody had before. One piece changes the weight of another, and eventually, if investigators are able to reconstruct the final hours accurately enough, the uncertainty begins to disappear. That is what we should be waiting for. Not the next rumor, not the next viral clip, not the next television theory. The evidence. Because Hayden Panettiere's story deserves nothing less. And if the neighbor's testimony does turn out to be an important piece of the larger picture, it will not be because she solved the case. It will be because she remembered what she heard when Hayden was still alive. when the world outside that building had no idea how much was happening behind those doors. That is what makes this development so haunting. The warning signs, according to the people around Hayden, were there. The arguments were there. The fear was there. The legal history was there. And now, after Hayden's death, those old memories are being heard again. The question is what they mean. That answer has to come from the evidence. And until it does, we should keep the questions open, keep the facts separate from the allegations, and remember that there is still a person at the center of all of this. Hayden Panettiere. Not a theory, not a headline. A woman whose life was complicated, painful, extraordinarily public, and ultimately cut short. If you want to follow the case as new verified developments emerge, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. And tell me in the comments which part of the investigation you think deserves the closest attention right now. The timeline of Hayden's final mourning, the medical evidence, the Narcan question, or the testimony from the people who witnessed her relationship with Brian. Because this story is not finished. And until the final evidence is in, neither is the search for the truth.